And speaking of much, much later, I want to kick off a little bit first by talking about that. We also have to be really careful with the word of wisdom that we don't interpret it through our modern lens, through today's standards of how we see the church. The word of wisdom has become so ubiquitous and synonymous with faithfulness. I mean, it's part of our temple recommend questions. We can't go into the temple without obeying the word of wisdom, that we assume that it was always like that. You know, a common thing that's brought up in academic circles is this idea of presentism. Presentism means that we uncritically adhere to the present day attitudes or the values of modern times and place them automatically on the people of the past. Well, let's not do that with the word of wisdom. The reason why is because the early saints did not view the word of wisdom the same way you and I do. To help you and I grasp how the early saints might have viewed the word of wisdom, let me ask you a question. How's your food storage coming? How's your personal preparation with food storage and saving and getting temporal things saved up going? Well, I don't know, of the thousands of people that might watch this video, some of you probably go like, hey, really well, particularly given our last year with COVID and some of the societal unrest that many of us have been through. Some of you might be saying, yeah, I'm good. Others might be like, I'm not so good. I've got a little bit of money saved up, but not much. I don't have much, if any, food. And maybe you're thinking, I should do better with that. The reason why I share that example is because your same mentality with food storage is the way that the early church viewed the word of wisdom. Yes, there are lots of I could show you scores of prophetic teachings, official things from the church that we should save up and store and be prepared. But it's not a defining marker of faithfulness. It's not something that defines whether somebody's a covenant keeper or not. And in the early church, even though we have different statements from various leaders encouraging people to obey the word of wisdom, it's going to take about 100 years for the word of wisdom to become a commandment for the church. And I'll show little by little how that progression happens. But the reason why I say this is important is because you will find examples of pioneers crossing the plains and Brigham telling them to take coffee and tea. You will find examples of Brigham Young smoking peace pipes with Native Americans when they arrive in the Salt Lake Valley. You'll find examples of Joseph Smith drinking beer. It's right there in his journal. Here's one right out of his journal on the 1st of June, 1844, a decade after the word of wisdom is revealed. Saturday, June 1st, 1844, at home, some gentle showers, 1 p.m. Rode out with Dr. Will Richards and O.P. Porter Rockwell. Called on Daniel Davis, met George Adams, paid him $50. To John P. Green, now look at the end. Exchanged $100 gold for check, drank a glass of beer at Frederick Mosier's. Now, that doesn't mean that Joseph was being wicked and rebelling. They're just not seeing that as contrary to some binding commandment that they have to keep. It would be akin to you saying, yeah, I don't quite have my food storage ready. So with that, the word of wisdom even kicks off by showing that it was not considered a commandment for them. If you look at verse 1 through 3 of section 89, it starts by saying that this is not meant to be a commandment. Verse 1 to 3 is an introduction, and in verse 2, to be sent by greeting, not by commandment or constraint. Not by commandment or constraint. So when did it go from not being commandment to being commandment and constraint? Well, there's some indications early on that they took the word of wisdom seriously. Joseph Smith one time refused to give a priesthood office holder, he refused to let him act in his office if he refused to strive to comply with the word of wisdom. In 1851, when we do get to the valley, by the way, Brigham Young will ask for and receive a sustaining vote that we should commit to live the word of wisdom. He says, all the boys under 90 years of age, I like to joke that some 95-year-old was like, yes. But there was still some confusion. In 1880, decades later, George Q. Cannon publicly teaches that it's not a commandment. It's just kind and wise counsel that we should commit to. And in all fairness, Brigham Young would struggle with it. He'd commit to not using tobacco, but then every now and then go back to it. Even in 1883, John Taylor emphasized with the Quorum of the 12 their need to more fully live the word of wisdom. And he says, quote, as we all more or less have been negligent upon that point. That's in late 1880s. In 1894, it's starting to grow a little bit, and Heber J. Grant and Joseph F. Smith, after a talk by Brigham Young Jr., by the way, who says, do you remember my father decades ago said that we should live this? Saying that it should be a commandment. They both confirm that it's a commandment for the saints. So this is at the very end of the 1800s, as we're getting ready to move in the 1900s. In 1901, President Joseph F. Smith began withholding temple recommends from repeat offenders of the word of wisdom. But he still had some leniency for older saints. And when Heber J. Grant becomes president of the church in 1918, it starts to become a standing practice to only issue temple recommends to those who will obey in the word of wisdom. By the time Heber J. Grant dies in 1945, it's accepted as a standard practice for all faithful saints. By the way, it's not coincidental, in my opinion, either, that the word of wisdom becoming a binding expected commandment for the church also coincides at the same time of prohibition in the United States of America. And this chart right here that you can see, this is a chart, a histogram showing how many times normalized, the data is normalized here, how many times the word of wisdom has been mentioned by decade. And you can see in the early 1900s, 1920s, 30s, and 40s in particular, it received a real heavy emphasis as it became this binding commandment. It's such a binding commandment that today that we will not baptize people into the church unless they commit to living the word of wisdom. And obviously, it's one of the temple recommend questions. One of the temple recommend questions now is, do you understand and obey the word of wisdom? That understand was added in there. And I hope this video is helping and will help in grasping with some understanding. So let's talk a little bit about what the Revelation is saying as a whole. I want you to understand that the word of wisdom is future looking. I just talked about how it took 100 years. It is one of those unique revelations where the Lord says in verse 4, because of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men, I have warned you and forewarn you by giving you this word of wisdom. Now, us today, we can see the wisdom in that. We can see tobacco companies manipulating data and marketing and trying to make things addictive. We need to be wise still to understand that there are yet things today or in the future that pertain to the items that are specifically discussed in the word of wisdom, or other things that prophets may warn against and forewarn against, that we need to be wise, that conspiring men continue in various ways today. It's not just a tobacco industry thing. There's other ways.